Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to have you along this afternoon. And I think we've got a really good webinar for you today. It's getting mainstream media coverage for your advocacy efforts. And I've got Josh Habersky and Eric Story here today. And you'll all be familiar with Josh for sure, and probably Eric too. Josh is the Director of Advocacy at the Independent Community Bankers of America. He's also the chairman of the Grassroots Professional Network. And Eric is the Senior Account Supervisor at Edelman and was formerly at the American Academy of Family Physicians and is the Executive Director of the Grassroots Professional Network. And I'm Anne Dermody. I'm the Content Marketing Director here at CQ. And we're not going to spend too long here on introductions, but I'm going to turn it over to Josh now to get going here.
Thank you, Anne. Certainly an interesting topic. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you and Eric have to say as well. But we'll talk some of the basics about amplifying your advocacy efforts using media first, and some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So, utilizing and leveraging the media, of course you want to get public attention. A lot of us are focused on the policy publications, the roll calls of the world, organizational reputation. Once you place something in one of those outlets, you're building your Washington brand, so to speak, where you'll be a recognizable entity within the Beltway. And that has a lot of importance, maybe not necessarily for the issue that you're working on right now, but in the future as you're working on some of the other things. It's also a tangible metric where you're able to report back to your boss and tell them, we placed this this information in X number of publications, print, media, digital, across the board. And it's something that you can add to your traditional stats of action alerts and social media posts and things like that. Anytime you put something in the media, you'll have the opportunity to increase activity. If people are reading about it, they're recognizing what's going on in your organization, they may follow the links and go ahead and increase your action rates for an alert itself after they read the information. You're tapping into new audiences through a different communication mechanism. Of course, along the lines of recruitment, maybe you'll find some of those advocates that are, not just the click emails or the social media, but people that are really vested in what your organization is about and what they have to offer. So you can recruit folks along those lines, not necessarily directly, but indirectly as they read the information and process the content. I also think that the media, in terms of advocacy, presents itself a perfect means for notable people within your organization, whether it's your CEO, your board, to be placed and talk about these issues in a favorable way. And when they're equipped with the metrics of what's going on and how many people petitioned an issue or sent messages to Congress, those stats are invaluable to them, and they can really showcase the weight of the organization and the power that they have. The membership are interested in this also. So I think that once you in fact place something in the media, of course, spread it out on your own social media channels, your own internal newsletter. Let folks know that you have the power to get placed in a lot of these prominent publications and that you're out there. So the membership itself or your advocate base, they're interested in reading about it, especially when you can, say your advocacy efforts in the same context as a major publication like Roll Call. So what is interesting in terms of advocacy content that might get picked up in the media? And I think Eric and Anne might have some things to add later on with this, but of course, a policy pivot. If you're going to change policy, if you've had something that's been going on for 10 years and all of a sudden there's a nuance to it or a change, that's something that will be highlighted and that media outlets will want to pick up on. I also think anything that's high volume. If you cross a 10,000 petition signature threshold or a certain number, that high volume will want to get picked up. It might be a brief blurb in one of the morning newsletters or something that goes out in the afternoon as just a quick hit, but still anything that's high volume is something that's likely to get picked up. Petitions itself, by its very nature, that's an American tool of expressing government and civic action. And I think even if your petition isn't 100,000 signatures like some of the advocacy organizations have been able to put together for and against things, any type of petition that gets some quantifiable metric, you might be able to get that picked up, even if it's not necessarily in the mainstream media, but in a localized or industry press. Live events also present another prime opportunity to get something picked up in the press. If you work for a major corporation, trade association, or nonprofit, and have advocacy content related to your convention or obviously your lobby day, that's something that people will be interested in the media landscape. So your lobby day, how many attendees, like I said, make sure that you're tracking all of possible metrics, that you can present a list of facts that a story may be able to be picked up on, whether it's coming out as a media advisory or a formal press release. Local interest, again, when we're talking outside of the mainstream press and your members are, meeting with a member of Congress or hosting them at a hospital or hosting them at a bank, that's an interest story that one of your local newspapers, in Erie, Pennsylvania, will want to pick up on it and talk about Josh who met with Congressman Mike Kelly. I think that is an angle that you can get farther reach. That might not be something that a larger, DC press would want to pick up on. They would cover the overall lobby day, but the individual, make sure that you're targeting on both fronts there. Of course, expertise. If you have your counsel, your regulatory counsel, there's a very complex issue, but it affects a lot of people. They are the thought leaders that need to explain it. So that's another way that you can leverage an advocacy perspective where you're trying to get a policy change or trying to sustain a policy. Get your expert in there to explain a complex issue and, utilize them as the sounding board for that issue itself. Of course, the C-suite. The higher you go, and Eric, I know you have done a lot on executive positioning, anything in the C-suite is a lot easier to get placed, even if it's advocacy content and you kind of feed those, that message to the appropriate staff there. The higher you go up the line, the easier it is to get something placed from my personal perspective. So the role of grassroots professionals, and I think that this is, a very interesting point here. We really sit at the nexus between government relations and communications. And I think you have to work hand in hand with both departments, especially when you're pitching to mainstream media outlets. A lot can go wrong. There's a lot of risks associated with it. So it can present as a significant challenge. But if you are working in tandem, it really is something that can be amplified and your message can get out there properly. First and foremost, shared contacts. Grassroots government relations folks, they have contacts, especially in the industry press, the Beltway press. But the communications professionals have contacts across the country. And I think that sharing those contacts and having a meeting, a brainstorm session when you're thinking about a media campaign that's related to advocacy and talking about what can you bring to the table, what can I bring to the table from the onset will go a long way. Refined content. I'll tell you, I for one will fully admit I forget the commas here and there and the punctuation. I just think that, when you're working with communications in a partnership capacity on a project, your product, your end product, is so much better because it's cleaned up and refined. Advocate quotes. I think that, if your communications department is out there pitching stories on advocacy, you can provide the real quotes from the bankers, the doctors, anybody within your particular industry, supplying them with that firsthand information that's not from a Washington K Street lobbying shop or anything of the like, and talking about real people. That adds a significant element there. Also, they just have a lot more experience when it comes to letters to the editor, op-eds, media advisories, and press releases. They know the nuances of it. They're experts in it. Of course, Eric, you and I have worked on many projects like that and have experience there, and now more so in your new role with that, you're even more so an expert. But I think that, in my capacity as a grassroots professional, I always like to get communications and work with them on that and really have them take the lead, and I provide the secondary and tertiary support to them. So some questions when you're considering, should I put something into the media or work with the media on something related to advocacy? First and foremost, you have to know your audience. Who do you hope to reach? If you can't answer that question from the beginning, you shouldn't be working with the media because, again, the stakes are high. Is the media angle beneficial to your campaign? So does the risk or does the reward outweigh the risk? Are there any associated risks with it? Maybe not. But, these are questions to consider in that initial brainstorm session or meeting when you have GR and comms together. Does the media outlet in your organization target demographic overlap? If you're trying to pitch something and your target audience isn't Washington, D.C., and you want to get to your membership, it doesn't make any sense. So you have to tailor to who you're trying to reach in that publication and do a lot of research. And I'll talk about it in the next slide about researching the publication itself. Are you trying to reach the policy press? That's significantly different than your local newspaper that your advocate would be interested in. So media research, when you're looking at media outlets, you have to do research ahead of time. Sometimes you'll have consulting firms or public affairs firms that are helping you along with this. I still, for one, love to do a little on my own. I know there's common misconceptions about media outlets. There's some stereotypes about certain outlets. Knowing those, being able to recognize where those risks might be, are important. So is there a known bias out there? What is the medium? If you're pitching to a certain medium, what capacity do they have? I mean, is it just a print outlet? Do they have a magazine? Do they have a podcast? Do they have a digital presence? Like, what are the total assets of each media outlet you're trying to get? I, for one, like to, in the grassroots professional network sense, and a lot of the stuff that I write and produce, I have a list of top 3 publications. My first publication where I really want to get it pitched, start at the Harvard Business Review and go down the line and try and get some of the different press to pick it up. A lot of times the first one might not be the one that you actually get it placed in. So having some backup plans is important. Are there specific reporters and writers that are interested in looking at the topic and looking at it from an advocacy perspective that you think that you can reach out to? Are there pre-existing relationships with yourself or within your organization? And have they done past stories on content that's related to what you're talking about? And then finally, like timeliness and success rate. Are they going to be able to put something up during a time when it's prime, when Congress is looking at something, when the regulators are looking at something? You need it to happen within a week or two. You've planned it out. You have everything ready to go. But if this press takes 2 months to put something together, that's not the outlet that you want to present to. And what is the success rate? If you have pitched to the same outlet 10 times, you have a crunch project, why would you pitch to them again, knowing that there hasn't been a pre-existing success rate with that? And, you know, I'm interested again to see, Eric and Ann, what you have to say along those lines. This is just kind of my personal thought. In terms of success in boosting the media placement, distribute through your organizational channels, as I mentioned. You know, put it in your newsletter, put it on your social media channels, internal employee communications posting. So one of the neat things that I think our comms department does really well, when something goes out in the media, they'll send us the article and have a set of sample tweets for employees to post. And a lot of our folks will just copy and paste those, and we'll get significant reach. And a lot of the people that are posting this are high up in the organization. They have a reputation within our industry itself, and may have some other, they might be connected or followers or following other press or other significant Washington influencers. External communications posting, you know, obviously across the channels, you know, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. I think it's important to be careful. Certain things shouldn't end up going on certain social media outlets. So having some discretion there is appropriate. Clip and quote to policymakers. I think that, you know, and you can look at the Congressional Management Foundation. They have a study that talks about this. It's appropriate in certain situations, and I think that the study itself, you know, I would have to reference it again, but sending a clip or a quote to a policymaker during certain times is worth it. I don't think that you want to send media advisories or media clips of posts that you've placed every week. But if there's a certain thing that's tangible, it's relatable at a certain point in time, and you want to add a clip to it or a quote from a major outlet, adding that to your overall communications to the Hill can't hurt. It's also a prime opportunity when you have something placed in a major publication to resurface an issue. So down the line, in a month, when the issue is not being talked about, definitely post that content and get it going there. So I'm going to turn it over to Ann and kind of talk about what I missed and what Eric hasn't talked about.
Yeah, I don't think you missed too much there, Josh, but I suppose I'm going to take this from a journalist or a reporter or an editor's perspective. And scarily, I've kind of been almost 20 years writing, and from all sides of kind of that field. And so just a little bit of background, I started as a news reporter, became a features editor for a Sunday newspaper, then went and freelanced, and over time have kind of morphed into many different things, but I do know the pitch, if you like, from both angles, having been a freelancer and having been an editor who commissions the stories. And so when you think about what journalists and editors are looking for, the first thing I would say is they are always looking for stories, always. So keep that in mind, particularly on a bigger publication. For example, when I was a features editor, there were 40 pages that had to go out every Sunday, with a relatively small team. So we were always looking for stories. And I can't tell you the number of press releases that we got in where you would have to read through the whole thing to kind of see if there was maybe a nugget in there, which kind of leads to this next point of don't make it all about you. I think a lot of, not just advocacy groups, obviously, but anyone, industry, organizations, they tend to put in their press releases, they highlight themselves up front, right? And they'll maybe have the quote from their CEO, or they'll have, X industry just launches, blah, 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 whatever it is. And truthfully, unless you're in that industry, that's not that interesting to the general public. So very often I've seen the lead from the editor or journalist perspective buried way down the press release. And I'll tell a little story about, when I started as a news reporter, I had a very kind of crabby editor on the news desk. And I think it was like my third day, and she had us churning out stuff, and she called me over kind of very gruffly, and she said, what's this? What's this? And I was, trying to explain what the story was. And she scrolled down to like the 6th paragraph and she said, that's the story, So to that point of don't bury the lead, a lot of us get very flowery when we start to write, and very colorful up top. And you've got to really dig through it to find kind of the highlight. So I know it's hard to kind of keep the perspective of what the lead for you may not be the lead for the journalist, but you've really got to put on the editor's kind of hat and think, what is going to be most interesting to them here? It might be a metric. When we write headlines, we think in terms of always putting in, say, a benefit and a metric. So you can have something like, X organization sent 20,000 letters to Congress and changed a bill in 2 days, right? That's got a lot going on there in the headline, but it kind of tells you straight away what the story is, and an editor or a journalist will really appreciate that, and they'll kind of, jump right on that. And when I say the hook and the angle, you've got to really pitch that hook and angle, right? You've got to really have something that they can kind of latch onto there, because otherwise, if it's not there and if it's not up front, your press release or your pitch is just going in the, the trash folder and never to be kind of revitalized. So leverage your advocate stories, right? Like anything, if you think about the things you like to read, there's one kind of commonality, and that's that humans like to read and they like to hear about other humans, right? So your advocates, I think, in this case, are probably your best kind of forward-facing group in terms of capturing the attention of an editor, right? Because those are the ones that are going to have the heartfelt stories. Those are the ones that the policy or the legislation is going to affect. And everyone, if you pick up something like the New York Times, they will always lead with the story about the person, right? And then go down 5 or 6 paragraphs and they'll get into the meat of the issue, say, but they will always start off with, Joe blogs, is out wandering the country road, kind of. It's very story-led, even on their front pages. And that's there for a reason. That's because people relate to people, right? Include a high-res photo and a caption. I mean, again, this is back to my point of that editors are always looking for stories. If you include all the ingredients, you've got a much better rate of getting your story either in print or online. Make it a high-res photo, because otherwise the less work the editor has to do, the more the likelihood that your story is going to actually get into print. And also include a caption, particularly if there are people in the photo. The next thing is don't lose heart, and having been on the freelance side as well as on the in-house editor side, just because your first pitch didn't work doesn't mean that your next one isn't going to. It's all about, it's almost like auditioning for a Hollywood movie, right? You may not have the right kind of face for that first thing that they're looking for, right? So pitch, and pitch again, So this story mightn't work for them this week. That same story might actually have worked last week, or it might work next week. But don't lose heart and just keep trying, because it's really nothing personal. So mainstream and beyond, look at all your options, and particularly I think in kind of advocacy organizations, you've got kind of a different slant on where you can place things, right? Especially when it comes to trade publications, policy and agency folks read industry publications too, and that has the advantage of not just sort of spreading the word, but you also have the opportunity there to educate kind of the people who can really make a difference in your industry. I think Josh already mentioned online blogs, obviously LinkedIn groups, that's a good way of sharing with industry or with really kind of like-minded folks. I would say it's really important to build up a relationship with your media contacts. They're just people too. They'll be at all the conferences. You can get a list of what media is attending from the conference organizers beforehand. And really, they're just dying to talk to people. It's not as if these folks come with sort of any hidden agenda. From various different kind of industries I've been in, I know the conferences were a great way of finding kind of little stories and coming back all energized, and because you're really meeting the people in the industry. And And actually, journalists don't really have that opportunity very often. So, you know, really kind of cultivate relationships with writers and editors in person and on social. And you can obviously find them on social beforehand, and they'll certainly appreciate your sort of retweeting and sharing their stories as they write them. Think small. You're not going to be the cover story every time. Kind of what I mean about this is if you look at most publications, particularly say magazines, if you look at the first sort of 20 pages or 10 pages, they'll often have like a report section or a roundup section or a kind of a news section. And it's much easier get into those than it is to get a big feature story, right? And it'll be much quicker. It's a quicker kind of return on investment, if you like. And you know, most people have their features planned out way in advance, but they don't have their news stories, obviously, or their roundups. So if you can just kind of send off a couple of, you know, maybe a couple of 100 words with some sort of snappy headline and a good photograph, you've got a much better chance of getting in there. And again, back to that same point that, you know, editors are always looking for stories, right? And particularly for those parts of magazines and online blogs and things like that. Watch where you're pitching. So this is a pet peeve. I can't tell you, even with Connectivity, our resource center, clearly it's for advocacy and government relations people, but I get fashion pitches and, you know, finance pitches, and it's very clear that, you know, the person pitching has not even read the blog. And honestly, that's just annoying. And so, you know, really kind of don't waste your time by sending emails and pitches to places that are, you know, they're never going to get put up. Ask for a backlink. This kind of leads to my next slide, which is just wanted to kind of highlight the National Education Association's 1 million emails to senators during the Betsy DeVos confirmation. So the National Education Association used our product CQ Engage to send these emails. But because they sent so many, they actually got a you know, really great story in the Washington Post. Now, we could have just left it at that. It was nice, right? It's our tool. But what we did is we called up the reporter and we asked them to backlink to our product, right? And that makes a big difference. And reporters are more than happy to do that. So when you do get something posted, even if it's something that you didn't generate yourself, just call up the reporter and you know, it takes them 20 seconds to put in a backlink. But that could be really valuable for you, particularly if you're an organization that's trying to drive traffic to your homepage. You know, a byline in a big newspaper is really valuable in that sense. And the other organization I wanted to highlight here is the Texas Medical Association. They were fighting a regulation and over a weekend managed to get 1,500 comments to on regs.gov, and their story got picked up by Politico, which of course was great for them too. But particularly I would say for state organizations, don't forget your local newspaper. You know, we know that the one thing that you know, Congress or state or local lawmakers will listen to is constituents, right? And they don't want to, you know, necessarily be reading about something in their local media that paints them in a bad light. So if it's something that you're kind of fighting at a state or local level, don't forget that in the states sometimes media is even bigger. Truthfully, you know, it's I think still in a lot of kind of cities and towns in America, people still read the local newspaper. You know, so don't underestimate that. And that's kind of all I've really got. So now I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Oh, but one last thing before we do, I don't think any of us mentioned radio yet, right? You know, radio is another valuable outlet that gets a kind of has a big impact all at once, you know. So don't be afraid to pitch like your local radio or talk radio, particularly here in DC, you know, NPR, any of those radio stations are worth a shot too. All right, Eric.
All right, thank you both so much. I think Ann and Josh did an incredible job of laying out the importance of getting your story in the press and get coverage for those things and the value that can bring to your campaign in general. But I would like to really kind of dive into some of the best practices in actually getting your story placed and how to do this in the best way. Because after all, the main goal is to generate awareness for your issue. And that doesn't necessarily mean just the shotgun spread fire approach. That really is sort of the best coverage over the most coverage. So whenever you kind of go and look at these things, you really need to look at the outlet who you want to pitch to first. It really matters where everybody gets their news from, because now more than ever, studies have shown that people aren't going to the news to get their news. They're going to the news to reaffirm their feelings and their insights on these things. So you need to decide, what are your goals? What are you trying to do here? Are you trying to reaffirm a positive stance? If so, you need to go to some of your friendly channels and place things in a more positive light. If not, you need to really frame your issue in something that contradicts something. Media loves conflict, and whenever they see a contradictory issue or a point that they can maybe sell as a firebrand or get people emotionally involved, that's always going to take precedence over just a straight news story. So whenever you're kind of looking at your media strategy in general, really try to figure out what tactic you want to evoke first and then sort of go from there. A great thing to do is to take these things to real life. In your press release and your pitch to your different publications, really relate how these things are going to affect people's lives and how it's going to affect the publisher's life, because a lot of this stuff really has to do with everybody anyways. So whenever you can relate it back to how this affects them as a person, they're going to take interest. And a really good way to do that is to set up a good media monitoring tool. These people send out things constantly, and they want to know, they want to hear feedback, just like you want to hear feedback on your success stories. So if you can set up a great tool, Sprinkler is a really great tool. TweetDeck has some great tools and built in as well. But if you can respond to these people when you don't even have an issue available, just to sort of give them some feedback, that opens up lines of communication. So whenever you really want to get something placed, they'll be more ready to see your name at the top of the list than somebody they haven't seen and just wants to get a story placed, and that's all they're looking for out of this. Which really brings me to my next point, which is how to get your story placed and where you want to go, because that really does take a little bit of strategy. And there is something that everybody has now kind of coined, trading up the chain. And this was really made famous in Ryan Holiday's book, Trust Me, I'm Lying. And this is an approach that has been proven time and time again, and you can use, it's a very easy way, but it's really the long game. This is something that you need to evolve your strategy as you're in the middle of it, but really keep your goals in mind. And basically the main tenets of this are, if you're just starting out and you have a story that doesn't just sort of grab everybody, but you really want to gain some traction on this, and this is something that you're going to have in mind for a little while, find an industry blog that you can place something in. Something that's very easy, somebody that has a little bit of a following, but doesn't necessarily have a national presence. You'll be much more likely to get something in a local post or an industry post than you will CNN. Then from that blog, take that to a more highly visible blog, something that you can sit there and say, look, we were quoted in this blog, and that gives you credence. Now all of a sudden you've got a little momentum in your corner, and you can actually take that highly visible blog to a local reputable publication. They like to quote different blogs, quote different authors that they're familiar with, and quote different industry publications that they know are credible. And now all of a sudden you've gone from an industry blog to a local publication, and now you can take that publication to a wider known publication. Things around here in the DC area are like WJLA. Has a very large presence in town. Most people at least tune in at least at one point during their week, and really have a lot of credibility behind that. Basically, if WJLA says it, people are going to believe it. And if WJLA says it, you better believe national publications are paying attention. CNN looks to these local stations to fill all of their stories. John Oliver is famous for saying that he gets all of his stories from local news channels. Every piece of research that he does comes straight for them. So if you can get on these local stations, you can bet that if you pitch that to CNN, quote that local station, you're now in a nationally broadcast network. And that actually is not the end of the story, because now is when you try to get back and be the hip crowd. And you want to take that back to the industry blog, because if you can take something and post it on Reddit that you got quoted in CNN for doing, that's where you're going to see the most engagement. People aren't going to see a story on CNN, go to your website, and just stumble upon your action alert. But once you get that quote from CNN, put it on Reddit, put it on some of these other blog posts, put it on your website, put it on industry blogs, all of a sudden with a link, you have huge engagement. And this has worked time and time again. It's something that national PR agencies do on a daily basis. And it's really how most news stories in this world come to fruition. This is something that is a sort of behind the curtain look at how this stuff works, but it's really simple enough to do. You just have to be able to keep your main goal in mind while being flexible throughout the process. But in order to do this, you really do have to do a stellar press release. And Anne did a great job of addressing this earlier. But again, you really want to start local with these things. If you want to pitch to a Washington Post or something like that, but you've never been quoted in anything else or never been published in anything else, they're not going to give you the same time of day as if you're somebody like Josh, who has been published in about 6 or 7 different publications. Like Ann said, you really need to be concise and keep everything in the first 2 paragraphs that needs to be said up front. But everything else that comes beyond that really needs to paint a clear picture and drum up excitement. Everything in the following paragraphs needs to be relatable, needs to give action items for something that goes on in the future, and really shape your argument in a way that people can't help but act on it. Basically, some of the best people that kind of do this, we can point to the Charlottesville incident that just happened. A lot of people tried to piggyback stories onto this. A lot of people tried to take it in their own way, whether that was for issue advocacy or whether that was just to sort of talk about the 2018 cycle. But whenever they started relating that stuff back to what their next event was going to be, when they started relating what people said during that, what executives said during that, to what their next conference is going to be, all of a sudden Charlottesville drums up emotion in everybody. All of a sudden they stand up and pay attention. So you're not just talking about some event that your association is putting on. You're talking about a response to something that everybody has a visceral, emotional response to. And that's something that is going to stand out in a pitch. That's something that's going to get you published and really going to set you apart from the rest of the stories that are coming in that day. And that's just sort of how the best approach to do these things are. It's to make people pay attention to you. And pitches are really just the bottom line to these things. The best thing to do is really to take this into real life. Experiential events are sort of the new thing that everybody's experimenting with. In the PR world, and Edelman does an incredible job of this, we really try to plan events just for the story. We have a client right now that has been in some trouble with some of the lower associations in their industry because they didn't take a hardline stance or not, and they didn't want to take a hardline stance. So what they did is they planned an event in New York City, drummed up a lot of media attention about this, and right in Central Park, they placed a lot of VR equipment, a lot of situations that make people pay attention, and brought them over. And now all of a sudden you've got great pictures, you've got other people to quote, you've got other publications that have cited you that you can then cite back to in their pitch, and all of a sudden that event becomes the story. So it's a different way of sending out just a press release. It's really about the preparation to the press release. Also, public service announcements are a great way to get things started. Nobody really talks about PSAs much anymore, but PSAs are this weird sort of middle ground between an ad and a mandatory post. I don't know if you know this, but if you release a PSA, certain stations are mandated by law that they have to carry that PSA. That's national coverage that you get. You're not going to get the most viewership out of that, but all of a sudden after you have a PSA, you can then drum that up to your next pitch. You also have fly-ins, live press conferences, and live streams that you can sit there and create some buzz around something and then switch that and turn that into your next steps. So it really is about drumming up that attention. And we all have kind of alluded to this before, but the first time you pitch something should not be the first time you talk to that professional, should not be the first time you talk to that author. Really make that effort ahead of time to create a two-way street, create a line of communication between those two people, and give them content. It doesn't matter if they use it. You're still giving them usable information that gives them a better picture of the industry, and they'll appreciate that, and they'll remember that next time you come around. You can leak things about what's going on with your business, what's going on with your interest, or what's going on with your opinion about what's going on in your industry. These are all things that just sort of open lines of communication, and they might take what you say and include that into a different story about your topic. You didn't get your story placed, somebody else got their story placed, but they're still going to get your viewpoint across in that story. Also, make sure and get your executives involved in this step. Josh mentioned executive positioning is really a big trend that everybody's sort of going towards. It's no secret that executives are at their lowest trust levels in history. We really are looking more to the factory worker as a spokesperson than the CEO or a celebrity. But people still look for executives as the moral compass of an organization. People still want to hear what the executive has to say about things because they know they're steering the ship. So if you can get an executive to lend a quote or even send that press release or somehow reach out to that publication, that adds a lot more credence, and that adds a different line of communication than just you. Now all of a sudden it's a meeting instead of just a cup of coffee. And you can really kind of turn these things into getting yourself some media attention. And that is really everything that I had to say for this stuff, and I'm happy to answer questions after that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. Definitely interesting stuff there. I do have some things I'd kind of like to revisit that both of you spoke about. And the first one is risks. Josh, you mentioned the risks associated with getting coverage. So I'd like to kind of hear a little more about that, and then maybe, Eric, you can talk a little bit about when it all goes terribly wrong, what to do.
Yeah, I think anytime, that you're dealing in a high impact situation where, a lot of people are looking at things, you have to make sure that your side of the story is getting told properly, that you have all your ducks in a row, so to speak. And I think one of the challenges that, grassroots professionals face is making sure that your stats and all of your metrics are accurate and you explain them properly, because the tendency in the industry, and I see this, is to inflate the numbers. And like you'll see a lot of these organizations, and it's in the press now, where they're talking about these numbers, and if you open up the curtain and you see the actual numbers, they're not what they say they actually are. And I think that you have to be extremely careful that you're being truthful and accurate in that. And it's not necessarily just the highest impact or, cutting corners around that. And I think that presents itself a significant risk if you, go down that route.
Absolutely, and if you get caught with some of those false storylines and when everything does go wrong, this is really the importance of media monitoring. I mean, you have to be on top of this stuff as soon as it happens. And there's easy taxonomies that you can enter into some of these programs that will give you those alerts. Anytime you're mentioned, you will know about it before anybody else. And that's really sort of heading things off at the pass, which just makes everything so much easier. We actually just had a client have a not so favorable story published in the New York Times. And because we got that immediately sent to us, we were able to send out an action alert to those people and just had hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of people comment on their Facebook post for the article, message them directly, tweet out with their handle on there. And all of a sudden, that became our narrative instead of that narrative. And that's really how you kind of change from this is not beneficial to us to now we have the attention, we have the media buzz, we have the spotlight on us. What do we want to do with it?
And that brings up a good point. Like, you know, say what you want to say, not necessarily what the question's being asked to you. And like, you know, most people might have a follow-up. You know, if they're a seasoned reporter, they might follow up with the question again. But in that initial question, I always will say what message I want to get out there rather than answering. Sometimes I'll deflect and not answer the question at all, but like it's the narrative that you want to get out there. You have a limited opportunity if you finally get to have an interview where you get to, you know, present your case and talk about your story. You know, don't make it a waste opportunity where you're giving, you know, fluff answers about something that your organization really doesn't care about.
Yeah, makes sense. Regarding op-eds, you know, we live in a very kind of digital world now, and we know print has kind of got a limited appeal sort of anymore, but do you think there's still a purpose to op-eds and getting them out there?
Absolutely. I think that especially when we're talking about, you know, not mainstream media, not necessarily the policy press, but I mean, I can speak, you know, from my campaign days in Erie, Pennsylvania. Newspaper was the way to go. I mean, we weren't doing TV buys. We weren't doing digital buys. We were doing newspaper advertising because that's what they've trusted for 50 years. And small towns across the country are in the same boat. I mean, I think that, you know, being in D.C., we kind of get the whole D.C. landscape and lose touch of that. But, you know, go back home to your hometown and see where, and talk to people. Where are they getting their news? And that's where mobilization is going to come from. Most of your action alerts aren't coming from Washington, D.C. or inside the Beltway. And once you get away from that D.C.-centric mentality, that's where you're going to see a lot of your success.
Absolutely. I would honestly say op-eds are one of our most valuable tools. I mean, op-eds are something that we do on a daily basis and in multiple campaigns at once. Op-eds basically have a very easy and direct way to get your story into a publication, which then excites your base. Your advocates love to see the fact that their issue is in a publication, that somebody on their side is addressing something. So then you can take that op-ed, put it on your social media, send it out in your weekly emails and your different broadcasts, whatever you do. If you have a podcast or something like that, quote that stuff because they love to hear that. That excites them, and that makes them want to then take action.
They also get, you know, a sense of pride from that.
Absolutely.
Like when you place an op-ed and you're the signatory on that, even if your organization helped facilitate a lot of the content for it, you know, they want that notoriety. That helps them. And a lot of times if they're in a business owner, they want to see themselves as a thought leader in their community, and that does well for their business side of things, but in turn for yourself, it does well in positioning them as the thought leader on a subject matter that the member of Congress or any of the elected officials can go to.
Also on that, those elected officials all have alerts. They all want to know if their name is getting said in a publication, especially back in district or state. So if you get them in there in an op-ed, that alert is going to come straight to the staffer, and they're going to take that straight to the member during the Monday meetings. B, they're going to want to respond to that, which gives them a place on social media that you can then retweet, repost, comment on, things like that, which continues the cycle. And op-eds are something that comes from the district. It doesn't come from the DC bubble. That has a very organic feel that they are going to pay way more attention to than if a lobbyist tries to give them information in their office. So it's just sort of catching them on all fronts.
I think it still kind of adds a layer of legitimacy too, even though we hear about fake news all the time. I think having something solid like that there kind of gives it some sort of gravitas.
Yeah.
Okay, so you both mentioned your communications department, and I'm kind of curious about this. Should you always wait for your communications department to do the pitching for you? Should you go around them? Is there protocol here?
I think it's a conversation. I've now worked in 3 national associations, and I think that the dynamics have been different in each of them. I can speak from the community bankers' perspective. Our communications department is fantastic, and I think that we work hand in hand on projects. And I think we view it as a true relationship that we can bring to the table on the GR side, and they can bring stuff to the table on the comm side. In terms of protocol, I mean, that's their bread and butter. That's their, significant experience. That's what they went to school for. That's what they've been doing for a number of years. So I would defer to them. I think that, in the meetings, I'm not going to say that I don't come up with ideas or ways to do it, but I don't think it's ever appropriate when you're dealing with media to go around your communications department.
This situation right here is exactly why I say Slack exists. Slack and text messages. For these kind of things, you always want to send through the proper channels. You always want to send a direct email to everybody involved and make sure everybody feels included in your organization, because you don't want to send something out and step on anybody's toes. But as soon as you send that email, send a Slack message. Say, hey, this issue is really urgent. We need to get this out right now. If you could just, put some eyes on it and give it a personal touch. That's when you can give all those sort of hints and cues that you want out of that publication or out of that action alert that you can't get across in an email. That just a personal conversation does the trick.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's about all we have time for, so we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks to Josh and Eric for joining us today, and tune in next time. Thank you.